Welcome to the seventh session of the INSEAD Global AI Series. I'm Theos Evgeniou, Professor at INSEAD, that I've been hosting this series. We've had some amazing speakers and amazing discussions, but today we have something special. We'll go through the 6 previous webinars and discuss about the key points. The format will be as follows. We'll have short videos for each of those webinars and then discussion around it. So you will see videos coming in from the webinars themselves and then discussion. I'd just like to thank everybody. Digital at INSEAD, lifelong learning at INSEAD, and most important, the alums and the MBAs that organized all this amazing energy around AI this past year. It's impressive. We'll be talking just before about how unique this energy you have all put together has been. We'll do today the session with Robert, Savita, and Niels, who are representing the alums and the MBA. Savita and Niels just graduated also. So let's get Robert, Savita, and Niels introduce themselves. Robert.
Hi, I'm Robert Macheco, co-founder of the INSEAD AI Global Community. It's really been great to see our students, alums, profs, and staff come together on AI. Today, we'll highlight some of the key moments, some of the main insights from all 6 of the Global AI Leaders sessions. I'll talk about AI in China, sharing views from a senior Chinese AI leader and an INSEAD professor, and discuss insights from a top Stanford AI professor, Percy Lang. We'll get perspectives in those sessions from China, from Europe, and the West Coast. Niels, over to you.
Hey, everyone. I'm Niels Wickman. I'm the former president and co-founder of the pretty new AGI at INSEAD Student Club. Super happy to be here. I'll also be covering a couple of sessions today. First, I'll be sharing insights from our session on AI developments in the UAE, where we featured a couple of top AI leaders in that region. Then I'll also be covering my favorite session on AI, which is its implementation in business, which involved our very own board member and leader of an AI-enabled bionics company, plus a former head of BCG's global think tank. Savita?
Hello, everyone. I'm Savita Yalamanchili, co-founder of the AGI Club with Niels. I'm excited to share our session with 2 AI legends, MIT's Tommaso Poggio and Amnon Shashua, the CEO of Israel's Mobileye. This was a truly inspiring session for me. I'll also cover Theos's conversation with Cedric O, the former French Minister of Digital and now shareholder in Mistral, a leading European AI developer, as you may all have heard. Let's begin with session 1, where we discussed with Tommaso and Amnon the journey of AI so far, where the future is headed, and some of the innovations we need to get there.
How exactly to make money from language models is still an open problem. It's really a bloodbath. There are so many companies producing language models. I think AI is so profoundly going to change society that it's worth the risk to start building the technology and later finding the right business model for that technology, because this kind of technology is so impactful on society.
20 years ago, I was dreaming of having something like Alexa, something that could work in the car. And this is what we have today. It is not super intelligent that can give us answer to the mysteries of science and life. Not yet. That surprises me is unreasonable effectiveness of predicting the next word. It seems that we can capture a lot of human intelligence by training a system to predict the next word. The effectiveness of that is surprising. Think about how our intelligence arose. The evolution of intelligence started with primitive associative reflexes. At some point, our brain, our mind became able to produce theories, abstraction that make sense of disparate facts. It may have developed an architecture that is different from transformers. Maybe in some important details, that's a big question, whether we need something different for transformer or we need to add something to transformers.
In autonomous driving, it has been proven that you can do level 4. You go to San Francisco or order a Waymo taxi without a driver and takes you quite safely as from point to point. Today, with the kind of large language model, is like level 2. We are very tolerant to mistakes. We ask it a question. If it answers correctly, we're happy. If it doesn't, we do our Google search and find the answer ourselves. This jump from level 2 to level 4 in the GPT-4 world is going to be a challenge. Tolerance for mistakes in an assistant that we rely on is going to be very, very small. Making it factual, 100% factual and 100% correct, even in a narrow set of problems, is still a challenge.
I'm not sure that's only a data problem. Humans developed intelligence. How did they do it? Certainly not using big data or special data. Try to simulate the evolution of human intelligence and see whether we learn something about it.
It will take time until we'll see robots performing tasks like humans. But I think the technology is there. It could take quite a long time until these robots will be produced at scale, but the science is there.
For me, session 1 was fascinating, especially how Tommaso reflected on how the progress of AI today measures up against the predictions made 30 years ago. His comments on the pressing need for thinking beyond the transformer architecture truly helped me think beyond the big picture that we lack today. Amnon's comments, on the other hand, on how hard it is to find sustainable AI business models was also very intriguing. His examples about autonomous driving and others showed us that we are still in very early stages of AI development. Like Tommaso, he also emphasized how much further we need to go for truly transformative innovation. He spoke about how we need to continue building models that do not just overfit the data, but should be able to learn, solve, and abstract problems on a much, much deeper level. Theos, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the first session.
Thank you, Savita. I must say these are two of the most beautiful minds I'm aware of in my life, so it was great to have them with us. Let me start with one point that I think has been really profound and to me very deep that Amnon also made. He mentioned in the video about level 2 versus level 4. We have level 4 autonomous driving, but we still have something like level 2 large language models. And the question is, why are we there? Is this a wall we are hitting? That's a topic we discussed during the webinar. And during the webinar, Amnon made the following observation. He said, the best result LLMs can achieve in math tests is about 68% in some math tests, 68%. And then he said, if we think about this, what kind of students can achieve 68% or 80%, 70% to a math exam? And the answer probably is, if you want to achieve this exam, this kind of grade in the exam, probably what you have to do is practice a lot with a lot of different problems and then basically only solve the problems in the exam that look like a problem you've seen before. So this is a concept of basically overfitting what you've seen. And that's how far we can go. This is very profound. Again, the 68% implies we are having basically just matching what we've seen before. The next question then is, which both Tom and Amnon talked about, was how can we go from 68% in math, which is based on overfitting and answering questions by following a pattern, let's say, of argumentation, to 100%, which requires coming up with new kind of solutions, new ways of thinking, new theories, having the ability to abstract. And that's where we are not today. Although both of them said we may get there in the next 5 years, which to me was very surprising. They both said this. I would expect they would say we don't know. They said 5 years, which is very interesting. Amnon was also quite confident about this, which probably something is cooking there. Who knows? And of course, once we get to a point where AI can also abstract and become like a scientist, then of course, imagine having AI being able to not just explain the general theory of relativity, let's say, because explaining something that has been developed is not too difficult. It's like you go from argument to argument, which is what large language models do. They go from one sentence to the next sentence. It's so-called sequence to sequence. Sequence to sequence is what they do. They go from the context to the next word, next sentence, whatever. So argumentation or explanation is not so difficult. You just go from step by step, mimicking what you've seen in the data. But coming up with a new theory, that's not clear because there is no step-by-step process to a new theory in the data because that theory doesn't exist in the data. So when we can do that, then we can probably expect huge revolution in general in terms of solving scientific problems from climate change to economic problems also, health problems, and that would be really transformative. The fact that this is expected to come in 5 years was pretty shocking to me. There is a lot more in this video. I highly encourage you to watch it.
So moving on to session 2, here we spoke to Cedric O, the ex-Minister of Digital of France and now a shareholder in Mistral. Theos and Cedric discussed Europe's role in AI and the journey of Mistral.
I do believe that one of the problems that Europe, do we see ourselves as a power that is able to shape humanity and the future of humanity because we have people that are at the table shaping the technology, or do we see ourselves as people that are on the side of the table and trying to regulate technology, which I think is not enough if we want to shape our own future. What we see in Europe is pretty enthusiastic, not only Mistral, but Aleph Alpha, but holistic. So let's build champions now. Mistral was created by 3 co-founders. The first reason why they came out of DeepMind and out of Meta was not to create a European company. It was because they were unhappy and dissatisfied with the way technology was unfolding and openness of technology. The goal of Mistral is not to be the European champion. The goal of Mistral is to be a global champion based in Europe. And they basically want to push open source. They want to push the democratization of the technology. And we want to be the best company in LLM in the world, based in Europe. We struck agreement with Google, Meta, Uber, Samsung, DeepMind, and a lot of them, for them to settle research labs in Paris. Hadn't we done that, there would be no Mistral today. When we struck those deals, so that Meta would open Fair in Paris, for instance, I remember talking to a lot of French big CEOs who told me, you are completely crazy, guys, because those guys, they will come to France and they will steal our talent because they are able to pay them 2 times, 3 times as much as we do. What I told them is that it's true. They will attract some talent, but actually they will keep talent here that would otherwise go to the US or to London, because London was also, because of DeepMind, one of the main global play for AI. And that's actually what happened. Obviously, they raised a little bit the salaries of AI researchers in France, which is a good thing. But also they kept in France people that stayed in France. And hadn't we had those like research lab, DeepMind or Meta in Paris, then Guillaume, Timothée, and ourselves, the founder of Mistral, they would probably have gone to London or Palo Alto. They would have met their girlfriend there. Why is Elon Musk choosing to launch Grok? Probably for economic reasons, but the biggest reason he's pushing forward is ChatGPT is woke, and I don't want someone woke to answer to my question. So he's doing that for cultural reasons. To some extent, it's embodying the fight that we are seeing unfolding on AI and on LLMs those days.
This was the session I was personally most looking forward to, given the optimism surrounding Europe's role in the AI race and the progress that has been made in the last 15 years. During the conversation, Cedric highlighted how crucial it was to keep AI talent within Europe. And for me, his point about how Google Meta struck deals with the government of France, which immensely helped companies like Mistral in retaining talent within France, was definitely the highlight of this video. Cedric also mentioned how Europe's progress needs smart investments and local talent development. He strongly believes that Europe can lead in AI if it commits to long-term goals and collective efforts rather than focus on short-term fixes. He also touched upon the important debate on AI regulatory frameworks. Today, Europe is undoubtedly leading the way here, yet he also cautions the risk it poses of stifling the innovation in the region. And over to you, Theos. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the entirety of this video.
Thanks, Savita. Thanks so much. First of all, let me remind those of you who were there, if you remember, that we had a poll at the beginning and at the end of this webinar. And the poll was about how, I don't remember the exact wording, but it was about how optimistic are you about the future of AI in Europe. And at the beginning of the webinar, the majority, I think almost 2/3, were pessimistic. At the end of the webinar, the majority, almost 2/3, I believe, were actually optimistic. And to me, that was really very interesting and indicates the importance of having this kind of webinar series from around the globe. And that was the intention of putting this series. That's why it's called the Global AI Leader Series, to hear about views from different parts of the world, not only from the US, but also from Europe, Israel, UAE, China, as you saw, etc. Of course, the point about the talent war that Cedric made is very important. At the end of the day, the 3 raw inputs, if you like, to AI is the basic inputs to AI for the production of AI is data, algorithms that correspond to talent in some ways, but also so to data, of course, in some ways, and compute. So talent is one of the underlying all of those things, including the algorithms and engineering of it. So data, talent, if you like, and compute with talent developing all of the above. One has to manage all those three things. Now, there's a lot of discussion about cloud sovereignty and compute capabilities. We'll come back to this also when we discuss about the webinar with Lan and Annette on China about compute. There's lots of questions around data and scale, the scale of data in Europe, the availability of data in Europe, but also the regulations around restrictions on the use of data that may enable or not AI innovation. But talent is important. And one of the points he also made, which struck me during the webinar, was how he highlighted at some point during the whole webinar, if you watch it, that attracting talent can be done not in many different ways, including through kind of lifestyle branding. Because these are all educated people, relatively well off. So lifestyle is important. But of course, lifestyle includes having around you not only pleasant life or whatever, but it's also having around other intelligent people like working on the space with you. Hence also the importance of building all those big research labs in France that Cedric mentioned. Finally, one point that I think is really worth highlighting, and I believe that's an area where we have to dig deeper and understand better, practically, research-wise, keep it in mind, is the culture point. He gave a number of reasons why Mistral. One of the reasons was democratize AI and have also AI, this kind of large language models, this type of AI, large model AI also to be from different parts of the world. But he also made an important point about culture, how depending on which large language model you ask, you may get different types of answers to questions about history, to questions about whatever ideology, politics, you name it, or any topic. And therefore, these new AI language models, but also video and image coming going forward, are actually, one can think of them as how, like the new media in a sense, that can influence the way we understand the world, the way we understand history, can influence culture, a little bit like Hollywood became, social media became large language models in some ways. And therefore, understanding how these technologies can impact the way we think, can impact the way we understand the world, can impact our culture is very important. And of course, this has a flip side on how to actually develop these solutions and keep track of these technologies so they are beneficial towards keeping the cultural diversity that we need, and also making sure that there is no, broadly speaking, misinformation, of course, that can affect culture in negative ways. Then the last point to make here is that, yes, funding, as you said, Savita, is very important. Europe, US, other parts of the world have some differences in the way the markets work, from the early investments to the exits to the financial, to the public markets, of course, and to how funding works in general. So funding is, of course, an issue, but Cedric was also very optimistic there. He made a point about how the investments in technology companies have, relative to the US, have become better. It's still less, but the ratio of how much was spent in the US versus Europe became better today relative to, let's say, 20 years ago. It's an input to any production. And AI has a data, talent, and compute, but funding is always there. So that's all for now. Lots of other things in that webinar again. Feel free, please, to watch it.
Moving over to session 3 then, from one ecosystem to another. Theos spoke with a couple of senior AI and tech leaders out of the UAE about the really impressive progress we've been seeing there over the last few years in that region, establishing itself as a leader in the AI ecosystem and really growing in terms of their presence on the global stage. So yeah, let's take a look at the footage from the webinar.
I don't think everyone realizes how unique this era is for a country like the UAE. There is a technology like Falcon that is competing with global technologies.
The UAE has embraced AI at a very early stage and much before Falcons. Already in 2017, we had the first minister of AI in the world.
The AI ministry here in the UAE has been super active in driving that agenda at the global stage.
Second step that we did is implement a university dedicated to AI. The next step that we decided to do is construct basically an R&D center dedicated basically to AI.
How can open source AI enable a fair and equal access to AI around the globe, especially in developing countries?
We're getting a lot of questions from many countries approaching us on explaining how we did. Building foundational models from the start is huge cost. So many countries don't have the capability, but they have certainly the capability of what we call basically fine-tuning those models within their languages, meaning build a model in Serbian. And there, what you need is a fine-tuning capability. From that point of view, basically, we have decided just to give the model as open source, but also supporting those people, basically, and those communities with compute.
Any comments on this question about this debate between closed, open source, safety?
Open source provides more visibility and control to the end users for them to basically deploy the way they want, and also deploy the relevant safety and security measures around their models. Closed source model comes also with a lot of risks related to control and specifically data, because these models don't operate in silo, and this is where there are other risks related to exposing the end user's data. Now, as any technology, of course, in AI in general, there are relevant safety concerns. We need to double down into safety and security.
How do you compete? What's a strategy given you have an open source approach?
Small teams and small, relatively, countries can punch way above their weights when it comes to technology. I think AI is actually the right environment and context for countries like the UAE to prove themselves and to actually leverage all what has been built. So collaboration is key for success. More than 100 universities we are collaborating with, or in the commercial aspect where we are actually partners with consulting firms, we are partners with hyperscalers, we are partners with end users, and so on and so forth.
Following the release of Falcon, I was particularly looking forward to the session just to hear a bit more about UAE's efforts in the space. And I think it's safe to say that the webinar, for those who tuned in, it didn't disappoint. Before I hand over the word to Theos, a couple of points that I thought was particularly interesting was to hear about the way in which Reda talked about the ingredients, what makes a good AI ecosystem. And Theos, you touched upon this quite recently. And talent, data, compute, research, and the ability to commercialize is really the way in which they think about this. And sure, I don't think this is a novel way about how to think about these things, but it struck me as interesting of how comprehensive and coordinated they seem to be, both at the strategic level and on the ground here. So I expect quite a lot of things to come out of the region, especially around some of the commercialization over the next few years. Another point I wanted to share before handing over to you, Theos, was I found it interesting the way in which they talked about their stance around open source and their LLM. I think Professor Maroon was the one who compared their approach to the likes of Linux. I thought it was quite telling in terms of how they're organizing their efforts. So I believe the research arm, if you like, want to create the Linux of Gen AI, but then their commercial arm is probably going to be focused on building sort of the next Red Hat of Gen AI, etc. So I think it's a super, super interesting region. What stood out to you as being particularly interesting from this one?
Yeah, thanks, Niels. You covered quite a lot of ground here. First of all, let's remember what Reda said at the end of the clip we saw, that small countries can punch above their weight, above their size. And that's a very positive message for everybody. Now, having said this, I think that one of the key lessons here, in my view, is that this can be achieved with a solid national strategy. I've been following the UAE for a number of years now. Falcon is a result of being a mature, in many ways, AI country. Asmer once said they had even an AI minister from early on, from 2017. I didn't realize it was so long ago, 7 years ago. And that, I remember when the minister was appointed, everybody was like saying, how is that possible? What is the minister doing? That was 2017, if you think about this, right? And then you saw how everyone was talking about bringing in universities, research, talent, etc., so all the resources. And that's, again, the power of a well thought out national AI strategy. That's really important. Which, by the way, indicates it has business implications about where you go, right? And where you expect innovation to come from. Governments, in some sense. That relates also to a bit what Cedric said about France in some ways. So that's the national strategy impact is very important. That's a key point here. The other point that was very interesting was, we'll come back to open source later on when we talk about Percy Young webinar, the last webinar. But this parallel with Linux, there is some parallel, but there are also some differences. But one of the interesting points here is the point of building an ecosystem around this Falcon open source. And you saw how Reda was saying they partner with 100 universities or something, private organizations, hyperscalers, consulting firms, etc., etc. The strategy that they are following is this ecosystem-based strategy, which is naturally fitting with open source. Think also about the developers of all sorts of solutions and enhancements of the open source system they have. That's the power of open source in some ways. And this is coupled with, as you said, Niels, with an approach which has the foundation, the open source foundation on the one hand, non-profit foundation, and the commercial business on the other side that basically takes the raw technology innovation and productizes it or creates services out of this. Because going from the algorithm, from the IP to the product and to commercialization, of course, it's a different ballpark, right? One more point before we move to the next one. It was interesting how Merwan, I believe, said that they are helping other countries that don't have the resources by providing fine-tuning, big model fine-tuning capabilities for them, for their language, for their culture, for their data, for their text, books, news, whatever. That's interesting. I don't know how long this will last before we have like smaller models that everybody can work with that are getting developed as we speak. But at least for now, it's interesting how different countries can be providers to less rich countries, less resourceful countries of this kind of capabilities. And last point that was not the video we saw that I thought was very interesting, it was in the webinar. At some point we had a discussion during the webinar with Merwan, which about, and Merwan was a person who put together the team that developed Falcon. So he has seen like the whole product development of Falcon, of a large language model, right? So the discussion there was about, okay, so how do you go around building? Tomorrow you want to build a large language model. How do you go around doing this? What do you do? Right? And he mentioned about different types of teams they had to put together, right? From red teaming to algorithm, to infrastructure, to engineering, all those different kinds of teams. And he also mentioned like the importance of data and how lots of the innovation will come from high quality data, not just the algorithms, but also the quality of the data. Plus this idea that if you have good data and you train the LLM, the AI, again and again through a lot of repetitions. So you retrain again and again with lots of repetitions. Somehow these repetitions, you pass the data through again and again through the algorithm to train the parameters. This helps very much like repetition helps humans to learn. I thought that was very interesting. This parallel with how repetition helps us memorize. Similarly, repetition helps the AI to memorize. And as I mentioned before from the webinar one, it's overfitting is memorization in some sense. So it's interesting, all sorts of teams you build together and practices you follow to build these large language models with these capabilities. Please go ahead and watch the video itself, lots in there.
Absolutely. I do recommend everyone to watch the video on the UAE if you haven't already. Everything is up on YouTube on INSEAD AI. For session 4, Theo spoke with 2 experienced business and AI leaders, one of which is an INSEAD alum, and she's also a leader of an AI-enabled bionics company. And the other one was a former head of BCG's global think tank. In that webinar, we talked about the intersection of AI and business. So let's have a quick look at the summary of the video.
Try to focus on what you have to solve now. Try to do it now.
It's really important that we get comfortable with that topic. You now stand here watching this huge wave of transformation coming your way. Would you be the one who will be swept off your feet and be tumbled about when it arrives? Or will you be the one who is standing on the beach with your surfboard ready to take the most exhilarating ride of your life? In what way would AI change the competitive landscape at the company level, but as well as at the industry level?
How you redefine the jobs, how you make sure that people will deal with new, more added value tasks to something where you have real productivity that will first be at a company level and then at a macro level. What we see that instead of taking 6 months, you can do it in 6 weeks. You can reduce the cost by 80%. So it's massive.
Where do we start? What sort of capital level is our organization ready? Whether it's from a data perspective, but also the talent, the kind of expertise that they need to access, the type of leadership we would need in the organization.
This frontier is shifting. What is true today might not be tomorrow. And this is why this notion of experiment is really critical.
The real game changer is the ability to execute effectively.
It is really critical to bring more imagination in companies, not just to see how we can reshape our current processes or redesign our current processes, which is a very important element, but as well to think about new things. The amount of energy that is required for this transformation is huge.
Key difference in AI, from other technologies, how prevalent or pervasive the impact can be. With AI, you can transform a task, you can change completely a process, even the whole workflow.
Culture and accountability can really differ by region, by culture. I worked in Western China, and what we found is that these people, they did not have good doctors. And therefore, for them, having a good diagnostic was really a question of life or death. And this is why they were more willing to give most of their data to have a good diagnostic. While in Europe, where it's, the notion of risk-benefit can really differ depending on the case and the region.
If you think about China, it is a formidable contender, really, because the size, but also it's got this sort of entrenched ecosystem that's been there for some time. So if you think about, similar to the US, the tech companies, the Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, the academic institutions in China, which are publishing really good research, and as well as having the government prioritizing AI. That's really powerful, particularly in the China context.
To me, I must say, I thought this was probably the most interesting session of the entire Global AI series. I think both Francois and Shui perfectly both describe the challenges and the opportunities that comes with embracing AI in business. Again, I'll raise a couple of points, and then Theos, it would be good to hear from you. The first point here is Francois and Shui's view on that you can't really embed AI as a pet project. I think instead, to be able to go beyond the administrative, you have to implement AI into business in a way in which fundamentally change how we work. And therefore, it's much more about change management than it is about technology. And I thought it was a really good point here about being proactive rather than reactive, and seek out business problems that we can solve with AI rather than trying to ask AI what it can solve for us. So I thought that was very interesting. And then the second takeaway really relates to the first one, which is Francois talked about tasks and how people associate their professional identity with these tasks. And well, because they have been trained to perform those tasks, they're quite resistant in trying to change the way, or to adopt things that fundamentally change the way in which they perform their job. So I think this is a very interesting way to think about the challenge of change management in relation to AI, because I do think that AI will fundamentally change what those tasks are. And those are the kind of tasks that people are trained for a long time to be able to perform. So I think it will clearly be met by quite a lot of resistance, and we already see it in a lot of different sort of use cases. What sort of stood out to you as being the most interesting topics from this one?
Yeah, thanks, Nils. You covered a lot of ground over here. And the resistance to change, of course, is a classic for any technology innovation, more or less. In fact, some of the value comes from the change itself, because if things don't change, you have bad processes, bad practices, or all processes and all practices, not necessarily bad. Technology may just speed up the badness or whatever, in the negative side of it. I really love one of the points Francois made, which is like we are in an era of continuous change. We're experiencing this the past year. We can barely keep up with the innovations coming out. I'm sure all of us are running out of breath. It's kind of blink and everything changed somehow. It's incredible. So this means that one of the key capabilities to develop is the capability to manage this change, the organizational level, but adoption also of technology in some sense. The second point related to this is also the point here that Francois made about experimentation. Experimentation is, of course, one way to keep up and one way to build capabilities. It's like going to the gym in a sense, right? So you build capabilities. Here, just to make a quick point, that many companies have been implementing multiple pilot projects, proofs of concept, POCs, and many complain that the vast majority of those pilot projects don't scale, don't go anywhere. This is, in a sense, if you frame all those pilots as part of experimentation and learning, then that's pretty good. In fact, you should not do pilots because they will not succeed. You should do pilots also because they are part of experimentation and training. And that's a very powerful point that was made. Another point that Chufun made also very clearly was the importance of not thinking only about tasks. No, typically people talk about replacement of jobs. And the answer to this comment is jobs are not monolithic. They consist of different tasks. So the job may not be replaced, but some tasks may be replaced, or other tasks may be augmented, or maybe new tasks will be created. So think of a job as a collection of tasks. But even that level of analysis is probably not the right level of analysis. So Chufun made a very important point that we should not just think about replacing or automating or augmenting tasks or jobs, if you collect all the tasks, right? but also about how redesigning workflows, how redesigning the whole processes, of course, designing the way we operate. Let me add here one point from Singapore. Again, going back to national AI strategies, I've had a discussion with some people involved in the Singapore national AI strategy a few months ago. And what struck me was something along these lines, which is how the new AI strategy, because they had another one a few years back, 5-6 years ago, the second one, how the country is thinking about leveraging AI to change whole systems, like the whole healthcare system, the whole education system. So really, the level of analysis should not be jobs or tasks, should probably not even be workflows, should be the whole system, how it works. And that's really where the big transformation can come. How would we have set up the healthcare system, the education system, and there were some examples in the webinar by Chufun on the healthcare side. How would we have set it up if we were to start it from scratch with this kind of technologies? And this is the system level analysis. I think this is very important. Finally, just a last comment. I can't help but to notice the bullish view of Chufun for AI in China.
I had a chance to speak with Francois on AI topics last year. There's a video of that. One popular phrase in BCG where he and I worked together on projects in the past is the 10-20-70 rule for AI. 10% is the algorithm, the AI itself. 20%, let's say, the data around that. But 70% is the people and change management. You must see this as well, all of you. Some are scared and avoid having anything to do with AI, hoping that it'll pass them by, while others do everything with it. I'm getting closer to that camp. What's clear, though, is that CEOs, company boards need to create an atmosphere and culture that's open to exploring AI solutions, and let people fail if they have to, but let them learn as well. Those who adopt early can build, I believe, a competitive advantage over time that is hard to match and hard for others to keep up with. On to our next to last session on China. Theos spoke with two distinguished guests, a renowned professor who chairs the Chinese National AI Governance Experts Committee, and an INSEAD Prof who is active in AI, also on a board. They discussed AI governance, innovations in China, and how they compare to global efforts. They also touched on broader implications for business society. The Chinese professor highlighted China's ambition to play a major role in global AI developments, but he also noted that restrictions on AI chips and related equipment have created big challenges, forcing China to develop its own technological path. As Professor Aris provided the European perspective, emphasizing the importance of clear regulation, which is in contrast to the US's more open approach so far, and China, which is somewhere in between. Let's take a look what Professor Aris said.
What Europe has done is really taking a step back and saying, this thing is going very, very fast, and we have to pinpoint and develop a framework which really focuses on the key risks while not impeding the innovation. So they've been very, very clear in defining what are unacceptable risks, which are around social scoring, exploitation of vulnerabilities, etc., etc. Then what are high-risk things which have to be approved before they can be launched. And so you prevent the worst risks, but enable innovation? And on the other hand, what can you do to stimulate?
Yes or no? Will AI be governed by global principles in the next 5 years? It is very, very split. Clearly, this is a very big challenge. The results, as you see, is mostly no.
This session highlighted the challenges in setting global AI standards. US and allies limit sales to China of advanced chips and similar equipment, while ironically, the West relies on TSMC and Taiwan for manufacturing of those chips. Despite this, Chinese AI has grown strong. The society there seems more open to AI than in other parts of the world. Chinese open source models are highly rated on AI leaderboards. The whole situation, Theos, feels out of balance. What do you think?
Thanks, Robert. So first of all, this webinar, of course, touches some sensitive topics that some of them touch, of course, geopolitical questions. And in my view, this also highlights that for us to understand how this landscape evolves, We need to understand not only the scientific aspects of it, not only the business aspects of it, but also not only the regulatory aspects of this, but also the national strategies and geopolitical aspects of this. That's what makes this topic very rich, and I think that's an important key takeaway. The second important point is what you said, Robert, which is about some kind of alignment globally about what we can or should do with AI and what we should not do with AI. Right? Can we have some values, if you like, so that we can all agree on, some limits we all agree on? Is there a lowest common denominator and any kind of harmonization at some level, at least, of the regulations around the world? Just the sentiment in terms of whether that will happen or not currently, at least in the webinar also, was negative, that we are probably far from this kind of alignment. Part of the reason, of course, is that because there are differences on the value side, if you like, and I'm using the word values because that's a little bit how, let's say, for example, the OECD and the OECD countries, Europe included inside there, of course, and so US and others, have been thinking about AI. They started from developing, it took a couple of years for them at the OECD to develop these OECD AI principles. I think a number of them that came out, I think 2 years ago, 3 years ago, if I remember correctly. Took a long time for the 39, whatever it is, 38, 39 OECD countries to agree on some basic AI principles. So imagine adding in this mix other countries also, beyond this 38, 39, whatever the number is, of OECD countries. So that's a challenge and we are far from it. A point Lan made that I found, third point, another point that Lan made that I found interesting is when we had a little bit, we got into a sensitive point about independence, decoupling, if you may call it that way, or are we going to develop two parallel universes for the whole AI value chain? I mean, from the semiconductors all the way to the algorithms or not? The way he sees this is that that's not desirable. It's not desirable to have like independent, disconnected worlds, AI worlds from a technology point of view. But on the other hand, countries, China included, do need to develop their own capabilities to build their own innovations across the whole value chain, from the chips to the data to the algorithms. He sees China's push in this space more like a push for developing capabilities and not a push for building a parallel universe. So that's interesting. Of course, this is also a political question. And finally, to go back to something that we also discussed and mentioned earlier for the UAE event, Lan made a very interesting point about how we should not forget the rest of the world. And then the question is, who is going to support the rest of the world in this space? It's a little bit like, again, this is part of a political game in many ways. Which country supports which country, and in what terms, and in what ways? Also taking into account the cultural aspects of AI that we mentioned from the webinar with Cedric O. And what are the implications when China or US or Europe or UAE or whoever provides the AI infrastructure and know-how to a country, when this is also coupled with cultural implications? I thought that was very interesting to think about. Thanks a lot, Robert. A lot in there also. A big topic, obviously, the geopolitical one and political and cultural one.
One last session we had was session 6. Theos spoke with Percy Lang, computer science professor at Stanford, very highly published, director of the Stanford Center for Research on Foundation Models. They discussed generative AI, foundation models, ongoing research. Percy shared his insights into how the models are developed, evaluated, and possible societal impact. Let's see what Percy said.
We define foundation models as models which were trained on broad data, usually at immense internet scale, that could be deployed to a wide range of downstream tasks. The normal way you build AI systems before is you collect a bunch of data, you define a particular task, usually narrow, like summarization or image classification. You build a model for that particular task. Foundation models changes that paradigm. There are 3 axes important to determine whether something should be regulated. The 3 are resources, capabilities, and impact. Resources has to do with how much money or flops you're putting in. This has been the one that has been adopted. We have been stressing the need to have transparency. All want things to go well. with AI. The immediate reaction is like, okay, how can we prevent harms and maximize the benefits, and what can we do? The problem is that we don't even know what is happening because there's no transparency. We don't know what data models are trained on and how these models are being used downstream. So we don't even have enough information to even have a framework for regulating these models. What does helpful and harmless assist even mean? You have to unpack that. And whose values are we talking about? One natural way is thinking about the plurality of human values and how a language model could either represent that itself or have different language models that represent different values. And one of the things that has been frustrating for me as a researcher, having grown up in the AI field, is that for most of this period of time, we had open research. People published papers, they shared their data, their code, and that is what allowed the research community to thrive. And now today, I see that the most capable models are all closed. The other thing I want to emphasize is the issue of liability. There are some thinking around, we need to make sure that the foundation model developer is liable for things that the model can do downstream. This can basically kill open weight models. An open weight model is a model like Llama 3 or Mistral that is released into the open, then the weights of the model are made public. And the idea of open weight model is anyone can download it and can use it for whatever they want. If you are liable for anything someone does, then it basically says you can't release models openly, which I think would be really a bad situation for innovation and for research. Agents that are meant to simulate humans. How can you actually make these agents more realistic? Can these agents actually mimic particular individuals? This is really fascinating because we're working with social scientists. Of course, it comes with a lot of different ethical questions as well once you're thinking about simulating humans.
Percy is clearly a top global expert on foundation models with clear views, though I do note that some of his views conflict with especially leading voices from what he might call closed AI developers, like OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google. Leaders there have a focus on safety and worry that continuing to open source models as they become more powerful could be problematic, as how do you keep the bad guys from using them for bad things? Percy's views on developers not having liability for confusing as well for me personally. Why should AI products be different than other products where liability does exist? How else will you encourage developers to create safe AI? I don't know, Theos, what do you think?
Yeah, you raised a lot of good questions. Let me, however, take the side of Percy a little bit for a second. I think he highlighted two very important points that actually he's doing really pioneering work at. Probably he's having the reference, the global reference work on those 2 points. One is on what he mentioned about transparencies, the transparency of the foundation models. And maybe people in the audience are familiar with transparency index and transparency scoring, that you can find like a transparency score of the different foundation models of the different large language models on Percy's research lab actually at Stanford, which is a methodology they developed, which includes, I was surprised by that, it includes like something like 100 different indicators. So they measure 100 different things to see how transparent something is. And this is a little bit like in a direction of open source in some ways. It's not open source in the sense of you have the code. It's open source in the sense you have transparency. Because at the end of the day, even if I have the code, that maybe not be enough. Second point he made is that, and I'm going back to the Linux parallel analogy that was made earlier on, open source can mean different things. Traditionally, it means the code is available, like in Linux, right? In this case, code available is not enough. You need to have also the weights. You need to have also the data. You probably need to have also all sorts of engineering choices you made in the infrastructure level and the compute availability for people to replicate. And that's very important to understand. So that's where the parallel between Linux, or open source, traditional open source software and open source AI stops. They are different. Now, having said this, again, he's working on not the open source side, but on the transparency side. And he also does some really amazing work on the evaluation. How to evaluate, can we evaluate whether it's open source or closed source? How can we evaluate that a large language model or a powerful AI model is helpful, is not harmful, and a bunch of other criteria. I mean, we can evaluate traditional AI, predictive AI, in terms of how many false positives, false negatives they have, because we have a ground truth there sometimes. But for this kind of AI, generative AI, we don't have clear evaluation criteria. So they have developed in his lab what is called a holistic evaluation of language models, HELM. It's a HELM framework, which has, I don't know how many indicators along which one can evaluate large language models. So he focuses on transparency and evaluation. And if we get those two, probably will go a long way to our safety, potentially more than just having the code available. So these are, I think, the two very important points.
Are we plateauing on development of AI systems because of regulatory challenges, especially from a European perspective? Should I get out? And a related question, in a way, as a business grad, is there anything in this for me? Is it mainly technical skills and roles? Before you answer, let me mention to everybody that the full videos that we saw today are available on the INSEAD channel and on the INSEAD AI channel, where we have a dedicated playlist. Anybody who has anything to do with INSEAD can join the LinkedIn group, the INSEAD AI community. From there, you see all our spaces. Similarly, all students can join the student group. So actually, Niels or Savita, do you have to the question that I raised any comments, given you're just finishing INSEAD? And then Theos, maybe if you add.
Let me tackle the second question around careers within the AI space. We did a lot of work on this with the student club this year. And Savita, you can fill in whenever you like. But what we found out was that if you want to join any of these more hot, large LLMs that are out there, it tends to be more within the business development teams and sales teams that there's roles for business grads without any technical backgrounds. There are also some emerging roles within the more consulting arm of some of these companies. So Hugging Face does a lot of AI implementation within large corporates and enterprises, and so does BCGX. Some of these roles doesn't require as much of a technical background, but it requires some sense of data science kind of knowledge. But then there's plenty of other businesses that are just leveraging AI, and the more traditional sort of business functions are open to anyone with a business background.
I can add one thing to this. So for me personally, as a student that just graduated, I was a hardware engineer before INSEAD, and trying to leverage my past experience to pivot into this space has not been the easiest, surprisingly enough. But I think what I've learned through this journey has been that there is enough to skill up and really quickly, and your best tool is AI, and that has helped me immensely. So for next roles, it will be doing whatever it will be in the hardware space, but in the data infrastructure space, and just being able to pivot like in a matter of 6 months using everything we have at our disposal has been great. So skilling up has become exponentially quicker in today's time. So for us, I think that's what works in our favor.
That's very good news, Savita, and a great energy and advice. In skilling up is something that we have to do throughout our lives, and technology can help with us. AI itself can help with this, which is great. At the same time, just to repeat something we said earlier on, which is it's one thing to do the technology innovation, the IP, if you like, is another thing to commercialize and build a product around this. So going from the technology itself to the product, to the business model, and to commercialization, of course, is where everybody in this audience excels. So that's where you have to focus on. Now, in terms of your question regarding regulations, do we plateau because of regulations? Regulations can be, of course, also an enabler of innovation, right? Think about financial markets. If there was no regulation, to begin with, probably there would be no markets, right? But you don't have too much regulation because then there is less innovation, obviously. So it's a fine line. I don't think we got it right. I don't think we will get it right anytime soon. It's a pendulum, much like in the financial world or any other world. It's a pendulum. We may be over or under regulated, depends on which part of the world you look at. And eventually, probably the pendulum will be shifting left and right. What's important is to make sure the pendulum is shifting. And for example, when it comes to the EU AI Act, I personally like mostly how the AI Act is considering the adaptation of the regulations going forward and the governance of the EU AI office and the AI board, et cetera, to achieve this. Now, having said this, we probably have issues from the innovation side with the science of it, as we mentioned from the first webinar, with the data access and quality potentially, the talent, but also the biggest one probably is that still today companies anyway are far behind in implementing even basic AI, forget about more advanced ones. So we have plenty of way to go for adoption of these technologies and value creation. Let's see whether we get there in the next 5 years or so with what we have already today from the innovation point of view.
We have a few more questions. Bill asks, what about energy? Are we going to run out before we build all of this? And also, what about having enough cultural data to remove bias in models? For example, Fabio adds that history in India or Europe or Middle East looks a lot different depending where you look from. Any thoughts on either the energy or the data and bias questions?
The data and bias questions is something we touched upon. So I think it's just we need to pay attention to this and make sure there is diverse representation, if you like. And also remember the points that were made by both Lan and Merwan about what's about the rest of the world kind of thing. So that's very important to keep in mind. On the energy side, absolutely. Having said this, we have to have also wear an optimistic hat, which is, for example, AI itself can actually help us improve energy efficiency, both at the data center level, but also more broadly energy efficiency and the transition to renewable energies. Lots of innovations there. There is a lot of very interesting innovations happening at the big tech space, Microsoft, Google, etc., Facebook, on how to optimize energy consumption, which can be innovations that can be transferred to other domains beyond data centers. So I think technology in the short term may have some energy issues, but in the mid-long term, probably it can be part of the solution, not part of the problem. At least let's hope so, as usual.
Last question, and then I'll ask each of the speakers to share their final thoughts. Will AI companies continue to attract VC investment, or will investment dry out? Will big tech just float the markets with free or ad-financed AI models and make nearly everybody else obsolete?
For what I've seen myself is that there's no sort of scaling back in terms of looking into the space. I'm not sure whether capital is being deployed as much into generative AI anymore, but that may be due to other factors. There's still quite a lot of things yet to come in terms of commercialization of generative AI technologies. I'm quite bullish to see what other things will come out there, and I think there's going to be quite a lot of funding that will be required to release some new products.
But we wish we had the crystal ball. Now, having said this, if there is hype, it's okay, right? So the question is not whether there is hype, the question is whether there is value, at least in the mid-long term. And if the internet bubble, if you like, repeats, we should be happy in many ways. Look at where we are now relative to 2000. We could be even happier if that doesn't repeat. But
so final views. Let's talk about overall takeaways. Savita, what were standout moments for you, or key points should our audience remember about the Global AI Leaders Series, Season 1?
So for me, I think for this Global AI series, my key takeaway was, be it UAE, China, or the Silicon Valley, unlike some of the other technologies you've seen, AI is as much about the technology as it is about the people and the cultures it impacts. And unless we have unique regional approaches and customize AI for different regions, we are not going to truly reap the benefits of AI. I think the way to truly reap benefits will be to build strong foundations in technology, but then truly customize, bring in every culture, even if it's at the cost of growth and speed. I think it'll be totally worth it in helping people everywhere. Nils, any final thoughts?
I think actually you put it quite well there in terms of just seeing the global impact that this has. It's been super interesting listening into leaders in AI across the world, whether it's UAE, China, or Europe, or the US. And it's been terrific to see how much energy that's going into this space. Just one more thing to add is I thought it was a really good reminder of how much we as individuals needs to adapt when we have a disrupting technology like this. I'll borrow the analogy of Shui in the webinar that she participated in, of when you're standing on the beach and have a big wave approaching you. I think the right way to do then is to take a surfboard and ride the wave as opposed to stand still. That was for me. Theos?
All I will say, I will just repeat that this topic requires a lot of different angles to think about the space from different angles, from the scientific, from the business, from the regulatory, from the geopolitical, from the political, from the cultural. To me, that's the biggest key takeaway. And that was also why the series was organized in this way, from different views from around the globe, from business, policy, and science. So it was a matrix. At least when I was putting this together early on with the team, I was thinking about this as a matrix, like different regions, science, business, policy, geopolitics. And it was like a matrix that we had to fill. And this is a big matrix to fill. And I think it's important to remember that we have to all think a little bit about each of those boxes in this matrix of geographies and the dimensions, if you like. So thank again to both the INSEAD alum, Robert, Fabio, the organizers, Savita, Niels, and the AGI Club of MBAs, and of course also Digital at INSEAD and lifelong learning. And hopefully we'll do more of this going forward.
Thanks, Theos. Thanks so much. Thanks for your tremendous effort in putting this all together. Thanks to the thousands who've watched the video so far and the thousands who still will. Special thanks to Niels and Savita for co-hosting today. That's the end of our official session. Thanks everybody for joining. We're off. See you.